Welcome to the 24th Bill McWilliams Memorial Lecture, and a very warm welcome to the Institute of Criminology. My name is Lorraine Gelsthorpe. I'm Director of the Institute, and once again it gives me huge pleasure to welcome friends and colleagues, old and new, to this lecture. So the Institute of Criminology was founded in 1959 as just one of 3 such criminology centres in the UK. And our strapline, if you like, is that we have an interdisciplinary orientation, meaning that our staff come from very different disciplines and work across disciplines. We have an international orientation with over 60% of the Institute's full-time students coming from overseas. And we also have numerous visiting scholars and fellows coming each year to enrich our conversations, some of whom are here this afternoon. The third characteristic of the Institute is its very strong interest in both basic and applied research, which means a very active interest in evidence-based criminal justice policy. It also means that we endeavour to engage with professionals and practitioners from probation, prisons, youth justice, magistrates, judges, court staff, Crown Prosecution Service staff, and others, including people from the third sector. And our 2 part-time master's courses are testament to this, because we enjoyed the company and learning from, as well as teaching, those professionals and practitioners. There's been a very long association with probation in the Institute from its very early days. And as some of you will know, we have become a national repository for probation documents, some of which were rescued. Jill Annison and I rescued some from the NAPO offices when they were moving premises. Some indeed were rescued from the skip rather, outside, which we dived into. And many of which have been donated by the Association of Chief Officers of Probation, and from individual probation services and individual scholars. We'd very much hoped to put on a display, an exhibition of some of the archives. We haven't quite managed it this year, but next year we promise. Just a little on housekeeping before I turn to the lecture itself. There are loos, toilets along the corridor right at the end. You turn right when you get to the end. We're not expecting a fire alarm. If there is one, a number of exits are signposted. If you need assistance in exiting, Jane and I, who will put up her hand, Jane and I will be at that door on the left-hand side if you need assistance. That's partly because there's a sort of fire-secure cupboard that we can put you in. Whilst things are sorted. It's not as bad as it sounds. Please don't use the lift anyway. I also want to remind people that the event is being recorded and will be available on the Institute website. This will include the post-lecture discussion and questions. And I also want to encourage people to post any questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, not in the chat, but rather in the Q&A session. We're anxious not to miss any questions, so Q&A, please. And though, just a final point on housekeeping, there will be tea and coffee available after the lecture for further informal conversation, so you're most welcome to stay. And we very much hope that you will enjoy this afternoon. Let me turn to the lecture itself, and just to remind you that Bill McWilliams, who died in 1997, had a prestigious career as a probation practitioner, researcher, and writer. And his quartet of articles on the probation services development, up to the point at which the punishment in community debate began, is now and continues to be widely regarded as a definitive history of ideas. He was a staunch advocate of the need for rigorous evaluation of probation practice, but an equally staunch critic of the excesses of the management ideal. He had an independence of mind, irritating to more timid souls, one might say, but also an approach that won him friends across the spectrum of political opinion in the probation service. There are many who would say, as W.H. Auden said of George Orwell, "How I wish he were still alive so that I could read his comments on contemporary events." Well, given the turbulent years of probation, how we wish that he was here to engage in this conversation and to consider whether or not rehabilitation can be rehabilitated. To keep Bill's spirit alive, a group of Bill's relatives, colleagues and friends established the Bill McWilliams Memorial Lecture, and this is the 24th lecture in that series. My colleague, Professor Rob Canton, is going to introduce our esteemed speakers this afternoon. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Lorraine. Yes, my name is Rob Canton, and I am at the moment the chair of the steering committee that organises these lectures. And it's my honour to introduce our speakers today. Before I do that, I would just like to pass on my thanks, if I may, Lorraine, to you and to your colleagues at the Institute. People who've been involved in events of this kind will not need to be told. There's an enormous amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure this kind of thing happens. Cambridge has been hospitable, supportive, and without their involvement, it's hard to see how this could have happened. So thank you, Lorraine. Our principal speaker today is Professor Gwen Robinson, who is Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Sheffield. And she's been involved in probation research for more than 20 years now. Gwen studied to become a probation officer originally, and indeed qualified, but straight away moved into research, and where she worked in the Oxford University Probation Studies Unit, where she looked particularly at aspects of risk and need assessment. She then went on to study at Swansea, and I'm sure that Gwen won't mind me saying that I'm delighted that her supervisor and colleague, Professor Peter Rayner, is in the audience today. And that's when I first became aware of Gwen's work, and I think others of us did as well, when she was talking so incisively and perceptively and critically about the processes of risk assessment. Subsequently, she's gone on to write about restorative justice. She moved to Sheffield in 2002 and has been involved in a number of projects since then. And in recent years, Europe has had the benefit of her insights and wisdom as well. She's been involved centrally in some key European Society of Criminology practices. Most recently, Gwen's research has moved towards looking at the effect of transforming rehabilitation, what that meant, what it was for probation to be perhaps fragmented and then now to reconstitute itself. That was the origin of our invitation to Gwen to deliver today's lecture. That much you can read about Gwen on the internet, or you can read in the notes that we've made available to you about our speakers. What they won't tell you is that at a time when universities are often encouraged to compete and to rank everything and to score and do all of this stuff, Gwen is among those who resists that sort of thing and is always incredibly approachable, collegiate, supportive, generous with her time and generous with her advice. I've learned a lot from Gwen. She's been good enough to help me in all kinds of ways. So as well as it being an honour to introduce her, it's also a pleasure. I'll embarrass other speakers later, but now I think I'll stop talking except to say, Professor Gwen Robinson, I invite you please to present the 24th Bill McWilliams Memorial Lecture.
Well, perhaps I could begin by just saying a big thank you to both Lorraine and Rob for those lovely introductions, and also just to echo Rob's thanks to the Institute and to all of those who've been involved in making this event possible, including Jane, who's been a big help to me in terms of kind of the logistics of the event. So it's a real honour to be asked to deliver what is the 24th annual memorial lecture. I never had the opportunity to meet Bill McWilliams, and in fact the first one of these lectures took place in 1998, which is the year that I started my PhD in Swansea with Peter Rayner, who's in the audience. But in those 3 years of study, and it was only 3 years, I'm still quite proud to say, I did read everything that Bill had published, and ever since there have been many occasions when I've gone back to various bits of his work for inspiration, or just to learn or relearn, I guess, about history in particular of probation. And of course, Bill's work is such a central part of the probation canon that I'm sure that is still the case for people doing PhDs in this area, even today, more than 20 years later. So I recently had an occasion to read the very first of these lectures, which was delivered by Ken Pease back in 1998. And it's one of the few that I haven't actually attended in person. But I was really pleased to see that the way Ken summarised Bill's work, and of course, Ken knew Bill very well, the way he summarised Bill's work very much chimed with my own perception of his work as a reader. And Ken said this: while Bill was deeply engrossed in historical study, he was also exercised by how things might develop or might have developed. So I do hope that Bill would have approved of my choice of subject for this lecture, which is very much about where probation is today and how it might evolve over the coming years. So I'm sure everyone in this audience, and probably most, if not all of those online, are aware that we are now approaching the first anniversary of the unification of probation services in England and Wales. So what I want to do is offer some thoughts and reflections on perhaps a provocative question of whether probation can be rehabilitated. So we are, of course, much more accustomed to thinking about the rehabilitation of individuals, individuals who are in fact subject to probation services. But what happens when we take this familiar concept and apply it at the organisational level? Is it helpful? Does it shed any light on where we are or how things might develop? Does it shed light on the current process of change or the challenges that definitely lie ahead? Well, I think, and I hope that it does, but you may be the best judge of that, and I look forward to seeing what you all think later on. But perhaps I should start by asking, why pose this question at all? Well, I don't think it's controversial to suggest that probation has been damaged by the Transforming Rehabilitation, or TR, reforms, which split the service apart in 2014. My colleague Harry Annison has rightly referred to TR as a policy disaster, and there's no shortage now of reports that would attest to this. No one now seems to stand by the idea that splitting the service was a good idea. And Dame Glenys Stacey, who served her term as the Chief Inspector of Probation through the whole process of TR from start to finish, arguably put the final nail in the TR coffin when she described the split as fundamentally flawed in her final annual report of 2019. I think it's fair to say that there are many official reports which have examined the impact of TR. What they've tended to do on the whole is focus on the outputs and the outcomes of probation work during the TR years, and specifically its failure to deliver the enhanced and more effective service that was promised. But I think there's also been deeper and less tangible damage, both outwardly in respect of probation's reputation and standing in criminal justice and the wider kind of social field, but also inwardly or internally within the organisation itself. So in the course of this lecture, I'm going to build on the work of several others to suggest that probation really ought to be understood as a post-traumatic organisation. And it follows then that recovery or rehabilitation won't and can't happen overnight. As the current Chief Inspector has said a number of times, unification is no magic bullet that will make everything instantly better. So my aim today is to provide some food for thought. Probably won't be able to achieve much more than that, on the subject of what it might mean to think of probation as being rehabilitated potentially. And I'm going to do that by addressing three different ways of thinking about that concept. First, I'm going to look at the traditional idea of restoration. In other words, the process of returning to a former or original state. Secondly, I'm going to consider a slightly different orientation, one which emphasises improvement and growth, and what nowadays is often called building back better. And then finally, I want to consider a different notion of rehabilitation, which I first encountered in Shad Maruna's work, and that is what he calls looking glass rehabilitation. And this particular idea focuses our attention on rehabilitation as a social and relational process. It concerns the recognition of positive change on the part of significant others and the impact of that reflection on the subject themselves. So I will begin by talking about rehabilitation as restoration. Now, as many people in this room will know, one of the biggest debates in respect of the concept of rehabilitation and understanding that concept in the criminal justice field specifically is about whether it is best or most usefully conceived as a process of going back to a former or original state, or instead whether it's better not to look backwards, especially if that prior state is not conducive to a positive future. So, for example, if the roots of a person's offending clearly are to be found in their social or economic circumstances, why would we want to restore them to those same circumstances, knowing full well that they are criminogenic? Now, when we think about going back to a prior state, we're inevitably drawn into the territory of nostalgia for the past. Morgan and Worrell have pointed out that nostalgia has always been a central part of probation's occupational identity and culture. Everyone in the probation world, they say, and I think they're right, has a golden age, and that often is the point in time at which they join the service. And that means, of course, that there are many such golden ages to be found. As they go on to explain, and as Anne Worrell has elucidated elsewhere in her writing, nostalgia can be viewed as a constructive activity, a constructive strategy. She says, a way of organising and controlling the present and the future, identifying what things were good about the past and should be held on to, and what things are best forgotten, but also what unstoppable changes have to be faced up to. And this, I think, helps us to think about the possibilities and limits of restoration. It prompts us to ask not when was the golden age and why can't we go back there, but rather what should we try to hold on to? What should we try to recapture from the past? But also, importantly, is that possible today? Now, I don't think there can be very many people in the probation world who would object to the idea of the restoration of probation as a unified service, or indeed probation service returning to its kind of dominant roots in the public sector. Although that being said, it shouldn't minimise the pain involved in yet another upheaval for the service and its staff. But it's important not to over-identify here with this notion of restoration or restoring the past. When we think about the unification of probation services, it is tempting to see this as a pure act of restoration, putting back together the pieces that were split apart by TR. However, it's not quite as simple as that. As the Inspectorate has pointed out, it isn't actually accurate, and it isn't actually helpful to consider this as a process of reunification, or, for example, of restoring staff from the community rehabilitation companies that now no longer exist into the National Probation Service. It's also not accurate to talk of the National Probation Service as a home to which CRC staff are returning, because CRC staff were never in fact part of the National Probation Service. Both of those constituent parts were formed out of the old probation trusts that existed until 2014. And for that reason, and rightly so, the service of today is not in fact the National Probation Service. And that terminology is quite important. Instead, it's known as the Probation Service for England and Wales. And that is in recognition of the fact that it is a new entity rather than an expanded version of one part of an old structure. It's also true to say that many of those employed in the service today have no probation experience prior to the TR reform, so they're not being restored to anything. Elsewhere, I've used the analogy of family formation in the wake of a divorce. What we're seeing is not the remarriage of the same parties over again, but instead the creation of a new blended family, a new configuration which is not the same as before, and which will likely be experienced very differently by the various members of that reconstituted family. There's also the fact, again noted by the Inspectorate, that today's probation service is fully embedded in Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, which is an executive agency of the Ministry of Justice, which itself is a government department. So as such, the service has been manoeuvred into a place that it has never been before. And it's far from the relatively autonomous structures of the past, when it was considered more important for probation to be embedded in and answerable to the communities that it served. That today's probation staff are part of a civil service is, I think, one of the least discussed aspects of organisational change. And I think we are yet to fully understand the consequences of that move. You may think that there is no way back from this. To return to Anne Worrell's wise words, not all of our wishes might be possible today. But then who thought unification was possible 3 or 4 years ago? Perhaps the impossible has already happened. But as for eminently possible and smaller acts of restoration that we might consider, I'm sure everyone in the audience would have suggestions about things that they would like to bring back from some aspect of probation's past. I'm just going to make one such suggestion here today, and it's one that Jane Donnelly and I have recently argued for, and that's the reinstatement of the supervision requirement as one of the possible elements of a community order. Now, as you may recall, this requirement was replaced back in 2014 in the context of the TR reforms. And it was replaced by something called a rehabilitation activity requirement, which is known as the RAR for short. The RAR was introduced as a kind of a shell consisting of a maximum number of days. And the idea was that it would facilitate the delivery of flexible and innovative interventions in what was then a fragmented and marketised context. But there's much evidence now to suggest that the RAR has not delivered on its promise, and worse still, that it's been confusing and opaque for service users, for probation staff, and perhaps worst of all for sentencers. Now that probation services are once more unified, there is no good reason to hang on to the RAR and every reason to revert to the supervision requirement, which much more clearly communicates the centrality of that supervisory relationship to effective probation practice. I think this small act of restoration could do a huge amount of good, not least in helping the commissioners of probation services, sentencers in other words, to understand that at its heart, probation is still essentially a relational endeavour, and that it's this relationship, rather than any quantity of days or number of activities, that continues to be the backbone of probation work. So the notion of rehabilitation as an act of restoration does have its uses, I think. It's quite helpful in thinking about probation's future, but perhaps it only takes us so far. For many commentators on rehabilitation, it's been argued that it's much more constructive to think about this as a process of improvement or growth, a more forward than backward looking exercise focused on development. The US president calls this building back better. And the same phrase appears in the target operating model for probation that was published last year. Now, of course, building anything requires investment. And it's good to see that the chronic under-resourcing of probation over the last 20 years or so seems to be finally turning around. I mean, I've been quoting the Chief Inspector quite a lot in this talk. I think that's quite telling. This quote comes from the most recent annual report published in March 2022. And we can see here the Chief Inspector sounds a note of optimism with regards to resourcing. But this, of course, needs to be sustained in the long term to make any real difference. Building back better, I think, also suggests taking forward potentially any of the innovations developed in recent years that appear to have longer term promise, even if the organisational contexts in which they grew up are no longer there. So whether that's under the structures of TR, and I'm thinking particularly here of the community rehabilitation companies, or under the exceptional delivery model that was necessitated by COVID. As I've suggested, the RAR is not, in my view, or mine and Jane's view, to be more accurate, such an example. But others have drawn on recent research to argue that there are, in fact, some initiatives that merit consideration for probation going forward. And I'm just going to give two brief examples. One comes from research by Andrew Fowler and his colleagues at Sheffield Hallam University. They've done some valuable research and offered some valuable reflections on the use of community hubs, which were common in some of the CRCs. And then Jane Dominy and her colleagues in Cambridge and Kent, Surrey and Sussex have similarly looked at blended supervision as something that might be useful going forward. But importantly, in both cases, both sets of researchers have made it clear that they believe that one size will not fit all. Now, in relation to the rehabilitation of individuals, we often talk about the building of human capital. And when we talk about human capital, we mean the development of a person's capacities or skills. They might be cognitive skills, social skills, employment skills, etc. Skills that can enable them to move on from their old life rather than going directly back to it. So can probation be rehabilitated via the building of human capital? And if so, what would that mean? Well, the human capital of any organisation is quite simply its staff. There's much talk in the official literature and the academic literature at the moment about the professionalisation or re-professionalisation of the services staff. There's been a lot less talk about the massive underinvestment in staff and in probation more generally that I alluded to earlier, which was over a sustained period of time. And it's this, among other things, that sowed the seeds of today's staffing crisis. Published statistics on probation staffing show that since unification, all of the 12 probation regions have consistently and without exception had fewer staff than they require, with the biggest deficits being in London and the south of England. And although numbers of trainee probation officers have been increasing very rapidly, training, of course, takes time. And there is no direct equivalence between a newly qualified officer and an experienced one who perhaps resigns after many years of service. So if you weren't feeling depressed already, this should do the trick. This slide comes from a recent publication from the Ministry of Justice, and it shows annual resignation rates of permanent staff in key operational grades across the prison and probation services. So it's not probation specific, but you can see on the slide that we've got probation officers featured and probation service officers, as well as prison staff. And it shows those figures from March 2016 on the far left side up to March 2022 on the far right side. And what we see is a steady incline for all of those groups of staff, so an upward trend. We see, perhaps not surprisingly, a blip in the first year of COVID. So from March 2020 to March 2021, those lines all have gone down. And of course, that reflects the national trend of employment insecurity and worry about what was going to happen after COVID. So we see a sort of a natural depression in those figures as people kind of just clung to where they were for the time being. But then we see, again, a very sharp upward trend as we are coming out of COVID, so in the last 12 months. And of course, that's very steep angle of the latter part of the lines will include some of those people who might have left in the COVID years who then were persuaded not to. So I think the overall message there is that the line is going upwards. So we know that resignation rates for frontline staff in probation have increased quite significantly since March 2021, after that first year of the pandemic when they were kind of unnaturally kind of depressed and fell across the board. I think what these statistics demonstrate, among other things, is that the unification of probation, which of course was announced in June 2020, hasn't been a panacea for probation staff who have continued to find many reasons to leave the service. Now, research on why people leave probation is scarce, but one small-scale study by Walker, Annison and Beckett in 2019 offers, I think, some really important insights. So they interviewed 8 leavers, 5 of whom had worked in probation since before TR, and 3 of whom had joined during TR. 1 joined the MPS and 2 joined a CRC. So it's a small study, but it is very, I think, very insightful. These interviews in their article are contextualised by a broad-based analysis of decades of neoliberal policies. And the interviews led Walker and her colleagues to argue that probation staff have for many years been labouring under worsening conditions that have amounted to what they call systemic workplace harm. Walker and colleagues suggest that TR exacerbated or intensified the experience of workplace harm for many. And in some cases, it acted as a tipping point in a longer process of struggle about whether to stay in the profession or whether to leave. And they were writing at a time when it had already been announced that the CRC contracts would be terminated 2 years early. And they rightly predicted that probation stood on the cusp of more turmoil, and indeed that more change was likely to prolong the issues and harms raised by the workers that they interviewed. And of course, they were writing before COVID. So, yeah, it's an interesting time. Now, reading their work resonated quite strongly with me as I've been conducting research in probation court teams around the same time. And I've made some similar observations, albeit from a completely different vantage point. The key finding of that research was just how insulated the court teams were from the kind of reality of the field for their NPS colleagues. One practitioner I interviewed expressed this really, really clearly when she described the court team for her as a respite niche. And that's a phrase I don't think I'll ever forget. Several of those that I shadowed or interviewed, in addition, expressed what I can only describe as survivor's guilt. And this led me to suggest a bit tentatively at the time that perhaps probation should be characterised as a post-traumatic organisation. So I have a look at some of the literature on trauma in organisations, and it proved quite interesting. The table on this slide shows different types and sources of organisational trauma, and it comes from the work of Horman and Vivian, who are experts in this field. Now, looking at the table, I don't think it's difficult to make a case for probation being impacted by all of the types of trauma listed in that first column. So we've got a single devastating event, ongoing wounding, the empathic nature of work, and the redemptive nature of work. I think all of those are clearly relevant. So, for example, if we take ongoing wounding, this would seem to cover the types of workplace harm described by Walker and her colleagues. And TR, I think, fits the description of both a single devastating event and ongoing wounding, as does the pandemic, I think, coming hot on its heels. And of course, probation is also a classic case of work with both empathic and redemptive features, which we can see in the bottom 2 rows of that table. So although we might say the specific examples on the right-hand side don't really look terribly pertinent in the probation context, we could substitute them with probation-specific examples to make a clear case for probation as a victim of ongoing organisational trauma. Now, I'm not a practitioner, and trauma-informed rehabilitative practice is an area in which I'm definitely no expert, but it is an area where there is growing interest and growing expertise in the field, as a recent report by Trillo and Bradley attests. Their report identifies 6 key principles of trauma-informed practice with individuals. And again, a quick dive into the literature on responding to organisational trauma reveals some similar things. It suggests a 4-step model with, I think, some clear parallels with Petrillo and Bradley's 6 principles in relation to working with individuals. So both approaches are focused on healing and recovery, albeit that on the left-hand side we're looking at work with individuals, and on the right we're looking at working with organisations. Now, Horn and Vivian make a really interesting point, I think, about the role of leaders and how critical they are in helping to heal organisational trauma. You can see a quote at the bottom of the slide. The print is quite small, so I'm going to read it. They say that leaders cannot always protect the organisation from trauma. However, leaders can help prevent the organisation from long-term traumatisation. The leader's approach may be a mitigating factor, promoting healing within the organisational culture, or it may exacerbate the negative impacts of the situation. And they go on to provide examples of leaders in many of the traumatised organisations with which they have worked, because they are practitioners in this field. And they give examples of leaders who became champions, in their words, champions of organisational strengths as part of a process of recovery. All of this suggests that the rehabilitation of probation and this idea of building back better might need to incorporate some kind of collective narrative around post-traumatic growth that's been documented at the individual level as well, with people who are survivors of various kinds, survivors of serious illness, survivors of serious crime, survivors of war and natural disasters, and those who have been bereaved. In the probation field, of course, this is all reminiscent of what's known as strengths-based rehabilitation, which focuses on a person's resources, protective factors, and future-oriented goals, rather than the more negatively framed and familiar concepts of risk and need. But I think a real challenge for the service's leaders at the moment is that first step on the slide. And we see it on both sides of the slide. And that is promoting a sense of safety or ontological security among staff. I think that is a real challenge in an organisation that's been subject to change after change after change, and which in fact has no substantial recent experience of either stability or control. And nor should we forget that the majority of the service's current leaders have themselves been through an extremely challenging few years and are not themselves immune to that same ontological insecurity. Now, the last way of thinking about rehabilitation that I want to consider today is the one that I mentioned earlier that I discovered in Shad Maruna's classic study, Making Good. Let's have a look at what he says. So this is an idea that denotes the reality of rehabilitation as a social process. He describes rehabilitation as a construct that is negotiated through interaction between an individual and significant others. It's not just a case therefore of achieving change or achieving recovery, but also crucially about having that change certified or recognised in the wider community. Now, for the individual, that recognition might be sought from close family, from friends, from employers, or through more formal channels such as the legal process of achieving a spent conviction when a certain amount of time has elapsed without further offending. Now, as everyone I'm sure knows, the current reform programme is very much centred on the objective of building confidence in probation. Inherent in this narrative is an acknowledgement of reputational damage caused by TR, which has stemmed in part from uncertainty about the different responsibilities and competencies of what were probation's different constituent parts, the NPS on the one hand and the CRCs on the other. Probation exists in a criminal justice field with multiple stakeholders and partners, chief among whom, in the Ministry of Justice's eyes, are sentencers and the public, in whom it says probation must command confidence. Once again, unification doesn't offer a magic bullet as far as achieving that goes. For one thing, it's redrawn the geographical boundaries of probation areas, now known as probation regions, for the third time in less than 15 years, which can only generate confusion. So for some of the organisations with which probation works, as I say, this could build on existing confusion and lead them to ask questions like, well, who do we work with now? And that means a major role for regional directors and their leadership teams will be to work on communicating precisely what it is that's changed, who and what probation is now, what it stands for, and why others should have confidence in yet another iteration of probation. Now, accomplishing this with sentences is not an inconsiderable challenge, but it should be feasible at a local level through the cultivation of trusting relationships and sharing of information about how community sentences are being delivered and with what results. So, in other words, it's something that can be accomplished through good communicative activity. But commanding the confidence of the public is altogether a different challenge. It's already very well documented that the public has little understanding of probation, especially compared to other parts of the criminal justice system, which of course are far more visible. And they're more visible for a number of reasons, whether because they involve wearing a uniform in the case of police officers or prison staff, or because they are regularly depicted in dramas, in documentaries, in literature, and in movies. And to the extent, of course, that probation is represented in the media, it has tended to be for less than positive reasons. So the challenge of commanding public confidence has been a perennial one for a service that has always been somewhat hidden in shadow. And now that the service is more fully embedded than ever in structures of government, it's perhaps even more in shadows than at any time in its past. So, if an important aspect of rehabilitation is the achievement of recognition on the part of significant others, then questions about communication, about visibility, and about voice definitely come to the fore. As an organisation and as a profession, probation very much needs strong, positive advocates to trumpet its achievements. Those advocates include the Probation Institute and NAPO, but also potentially the research community, who can play an important role in building and disseminating knowledge about effective practice. But for those at the front line, I expect what is needed most of all is a period of stability. The time and the opportunity to settle into new roles, in new structures, perhaps with new colleagues, and to consolidate professional identities in a changed context. And perhaps to be recognised first and foremost, not by the public, but by their colleagues, by their managers, and by service users as the primary assets of the service that they continue to be. So I'm going to offer a really brief conclusion. To return to my original question, can probation be rehabilitated? Yes, I think it can. But we need to consider these different understandings and these different dimensions, which all have slightly different implications for answering that question. So perhaps it can be rehabilitated, but will it be easy or quick? No, absolutely not. Is unification not a magic restorative bullet? No, it isn't, but it is a very good start. So what will it take? Well, like any process of rehabilitation, it's going to take time, it's going to take optimism, and it's going to take resilience. I was reminded at this point of Anne Worrell's 2015 lecture in this series, where she talked about grace under pressure and the role of courage in the future of probation work. 7 years on, I think that courage is needed, perhaps even more than ever. In pointing to some of the different ways we can understand rehabilitation, I hope to have shed some light on the choices and challenges that lie ahead. And I very much hope that I've done so in the spirit of the McWilliams lecture series, which is as a critical friend to probation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a lucid and insightful and stimulating lecture. I'm sure that, like me, you have lots of questions in your head. We're not going to give you a chance to ask those questions just yet, because we have two distinguished respondents we're going to talk next. And the first of these is Nicola Carr. Nicola is Professor in Criminology at the University of Nottingham, where she's Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange. Nicola is a former probation officer, as many of us in this room are, and there's some current ones as well, I guess. Since becoming a professional academic, Nicola has not only involved herself in some really important research activities and some instructive writings, and is continuing to be very productive in this way. So, for example, that she is co-editor of a book that's forthcoming with a couple of other people who are in the audience here today. Lowell Burke and Steve Collett and Fergus McNeil and Emma Clooney also involved in this on reimagining probation practice, and that's coming soon. Many of you will know Nicola best, perhaps, however, as the current editor of the Probation Journal. And in that role and in others, she is another, I think, outstanding example of the characteristic that I attributed to Gwen as well. If you want to work out how to publish something, if you want some thoughts, you want some ideas, when you contact Nicola, you will get nothing but good advice, encouragement and support. And she is part, I think, of that collective endeavour in which we as researchers are so much more effective when we work together than apart. The last thing I'd like to say about it, that like Gwen again, Nicola has made some really important contributions in Europe. And in the Council of Europe, she has been helping to frame guidelines about the recruitment, selection, training and professional development of staff in prison and probation. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Nicola, and over to you.
Rob, for the very kind introduction, and to the McWilliams family and the committee for organising this lecture, and to the Institute for their hospitality. I want to start by saying Gwen was very kind to give me a copy of her lecture a few weeks ago, but she hadn't quite finished it, so I didn't know the ending, whether probation could be rehabilitated. So I'm very glad to know that she's positive somewhat about that. So thank you to Gwen for an excellent and thought-provoking talk, and for the organisers for the opportunity to respond. In this response, I want to pick up on the themes Gwen raises regarding the possible ways in which we can view the rehabilitation of the probation services in England and Wales, namely through restoration, returning to a former state, building back better, to quote Joe Biden. I'm not sure if he took his inspiration from the target operating model, but who knows. That is learning from what has gone before, including the mistakes, and moving on, and rehabilitation as a social and relational process, or through the looking glass. As Gwen notes in the opening of her talk, there is a plethora of commentary and scholarship that refers to probation's many mythical golden ages, which, as Rob Mulvey and Anne Worrell observed in their study of career trajectories in probation, in people's individual accounts tend to be linked to the times in which individuals joined the probation service. This insight also hints at the fact that this view might be less of through the looking glass and more through rose-tinted glasses. Reflecting on this, I think about the time I joined the probation service as a trainee in the second cohort of the Diploma in Probation Studies, which at the time in the late 1990s was maligned as heralding the end of the profession. Looking back at some of the contemporaneous commentaries about the changes in the training requirements for probation, for instance, describing the introduction of Michael Howard's scheme as if he had personally designed and delivered the training as the death knell for professionalism, now seems somewhat hyperbolic. But more to the point that Mulvey and Worrell make, if you were to interview people now who trained and practiced in that era, the late 1990s and the early 2000s, they might characterize this as one of the mythical golden ages, a time just before the establishment of NOMS and when there were 54 local probation areas. In London alone, at the time I began training, there were numerous areas: Middlesex, Ilps, Swelps, Nelps, a veritable alphabet soup of probation. Gwen has noted the huge organisational changes that have been wrought in probation in England and Wales in recent years, culminating last year in the reunification of the public and private domains of probation and the further reconfiguration of the organisational maps into 12 regional areas. In light of such flux, it is not surprising that people might be nostalgic for the past, but speaking in the week following the nostalgia fest of the Queen's Jubilee, unless we project a hologram of an historical probation officer onto the carriage of HMPPS, I want to reflect a little on the downsides of nostalgia, while at the same time holding on to the importance of the relevance of the past to the present. As the sociological scholars Michael Pickering and Emily Keatley explain, the etymology of nostalgia derives from the Greek nostos, meaning to return home, and algia, meaning a painful condition. The term was first coined in the 17th century as a diagnostic for symptoms including melancholia. However, over time, its usage became unyoked from this original conception to become understood as a term referring to capriciously sentimental and variously commodified forms of the past. Consequently, as Pickering and Keatley elaborate, nostalgia has been used to identify both a sense of personal loss and longing for an idealized past and a distorted public version of a particular historical period or a particular social formation in the past. A resort to nostalgia has been linked to social acceleration. Nostalgia, to quote another scholar, is a form of reaction to the velocity and vertigo of modern temporality. In other words, nostalgia provides a succor, allowing us to hold on to idealized notions of the past in the face of rapid change. I don't need to drive the links with the government's vaunted proposals to return to imperial measurements at this time of pending economic crisis, or to underscore the fact that some commentators, such as the legal scholar Nadine El-Anani, have characterized the Brexit vote as a form of nostalgia for empire. However, I think we need to be clear-eyed about the limits of nostalgic interpretations of golden ages of probation. That said, I do think we could engage more in learning the lessons from the past, including through different forms of historical research of probation. And here I think about Lorraine and Jill diving into the tip to rescue archives. But this links to Gwen's point about the potential to build back better. This, of course, is a huge challenge in what Gwen has characterized as a post-traumatic organization, affected not only by the turbulence of restructuring, but also by the impact of the pandemic. The staffing challenges, including the large staffing shortages in certain regions, as Gwen has described, have been recently documented, and the most recent probation inspector reports provide some insights into the impacts of staffing shortages in different probation areas. There has been a focused effort on probation recruitment, and relatively large numbers are currently going through the probation training programme. However, and as Gwen has illustrated, at the same time, presumably in part impacted by the stresses of the work in the context of insufficient staffing, we are hearing more about people leaving probation, both long-standing staff and new recruits, to work elsewhere. So probation faces a retention as well as a recruitment challenge. I would also like to note that the probation service needs to do more to diversify its workforce, a point highlighted in the Inspectorate's thematic report on race equality in probation published in 2021. So what does building back better look like in this context? In other words, what would encourage existing staff to stay and thrive, as well as attracting others to the profession? In this context, the influential work of Albert Hirschman, a political economist who published the influential book Exit, Voice and Loyalty in 1970, and which has since been adapted in various scholarship, including by Mulvey and Worrell, could provide some useful insights. Hirschman's core thesis is that customers and employees react to decline in organizations by two main strategies: exit, in the case of a consumer shopping elsewhere, or as an employee seeking alternative employment, or through voice, being given opportunities to articulate what the issues are and to seek a resolution. He rationalized that the greater opportunities for voice, and perhaps more importantly, voices being heard and concerns and issues being meaningfully acted upon, created greater conditions of loyalty to the organization. Later applications of this work also considered the implications of silence and neglect when the options of exit may not be so readily available to people. In this context of the current stage of probation reform in England and Wales, I think that the issue of probation voice, and I agree with Gwen on this, is an important one. One of the more significant, as Gwen mentioned, and less remarked upon changes that reunification has brought about is that all probation staff are now civil servants, and as such are signed onto a civil service code, which among other things limits the extent to which staff can speak publicly about their work, lest it be interpreted as being critical of government policy. At the same time, within official discourses, such as the Strengthening Probation Building Confidence document published by the Ministry of Justice in 2019, emphasis was placed on the importance of a professional identity in increasing stakeholder confidence in the service, and the subject of professionalism being, of course, a theme on which Bill McWilliams himself wrote. And while, as Matt Tidmarsh has recently noted, the concept of professionalism is contested, to my mind at least, and within this context, part of the role of a profession is to have a public voice, whether that be individual practitioners contributing to discussions, such as writing for their professional journals, or as a constituent body that can play a broader role in shaping policy and practice. There is a question about how both civil service strictures and a much more centralised service than we have ever seen facilitates this. Enabling this voice, not silencing it, to me is fundamental to the question that Gwen asked about the future of probation. The other element of voice that I want to conclude upon, and which relates to the final form of rehabilitation that Gwen outlines, the looking glass formulation, pertains to the recipients of probation services, people on probation and more broadly communities. A fundamental challenge as probation moves into this next phase will be the extent to which it can listen and learn from a plurality of voices. Such communicative activity requires effort and commitment, and a recognition of the complexity of people's lives, and indeed the complexity of the rehabilitative endeavour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. As you can see, there are already people in the chat outside who are beginning to raise some questions, although you can't yet see those questions, well, not all of them at any rate. We'll be managing that later on, but please do prepare your own questions within the room, because I want to make sure that you have a chance to respond to what has been said. But it's now, while Jane attempts to make contact with cyberspace, I will introduce our second respondent, who is Jerry McNally, who will be addressing us from Dublin, if I'm not mistaken. Jerry is an assistant director of the probation service in Ireland. He's worked in any number of different roles in the Irish Probation Service and has been in senior management there since 2002. Is at the moment responsible for research, policy, initiatives. He has written a lot himself. He's published papers and made conference presentations and so forth, and is a joint editor of the Irish Probation Journal, which I think Nicola is also involved in. Jerry is a wonderful friend and colleague. If you've never had the privilege of being shown around Dublin by Jerry, I warmly recommend it. As well as being a great host, he seems to be very knowledgeable about local history. He's forever pointing out interesting places to look at and interesting aspects of probation's history. One of our reasons for inviting Jerry to speak today is his role as president of the Confederation of European Probation, the CEP. And Jerry is now a global ambassador for European probation. And he represents the CEP in planning for things like the World Congress on Probation, which is going to be taking place this September in Ottawa. Jerry is, as I say, a powerful ambassador for European probation. I keep mentioning Europe, don't I? But I'm not apologizing for that. At the time when our connections and associations with Europe have become less firm than they were, it seems to be fundamentally important. All the ideas about how to practice well and in principled manners and effectively and so forth, all of that is best achieved by talking to other countries who are struggling with the same problems and with whom culturally and historically we have the most in common. So the CEP and Jerry as its president are at the heart of all of that. Jane, are we in business? There's Jerry himself. Jerry, welcome, and may I invite you please to take the virtual floor.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And certainly, I'm glad to see the camera has come on, although it actually just shows the mess of my study rather than anything constructive. But however, leaving that aside, I'm delighted to be here today with you. I think it's been a stimulating and really provocative lecture. I think it raises the real questions about what we need to think about, because sometimes we idealize the challenges and we simplify the challenges and then we panic. So I think it certainly, I've been following the papers of Bill McWilliams since the 1980s, and I remember his importance, particularly in this challenging role and questioning what we did, but more importantly, questioning what we thought we did. Because sometimes we think we're doing good when we may not be doing quite what we think we're doing. So today's lecture certainly has been an impressive marshalling of the challenges facing the new services, the new probation service. And I think that was one of the key messages I took up from the conversation and the lectures today, and highlighted both by Gwen and by Nicola. This is a new undertaking. There never was a unified service before. It was a different beast, and it's going to be very, very different in the future. I also think it's about, I'm uneasy with the term rehabilitation, simply because I feel uncomfortable with the idea of doing things to people. And I'm very much on the collegial, on the cooperative part of it. And I really see more the development of a probation service as a beginning of a journey, because it's a journey for everybody that's involved, not just the probation officers, the probation managers, not just the people supervised, but also for the community and for the ministry and for everyone else, because expectations are going to have to be evolved and change over time. And certainly as a practitioner, and certainly I've been working in probation now for over 40 years, I'm very conscious of this idea that we need to work along with people rather than trying to do things to people. So the challenge really is to appreciate where we are now, appreciate the past, appreciate and remember the past, but not necessarily, and build on it for the future, because we have to be more future oriented rather than to be too nostalgic. And I think I would totally agree and with what Nicola was saying and what Gwen was saying as well about the negative things about nostalgia. Nostalgia, I agree as, and I was using the same quote that Nicola had on about the attempt to return to a time that never actually existed. This particularly came to mind for me because we've been doing an oral history on probation in Ireland, trying to talk to people both who were on probation and to probation officers going back to the 1960s. And it's been done by Deirdre Healy and Louise Kennefick, and they published a paper on it. But one of the things that really struck me was the observation was that probation officers reported and remembered the good times and the good things. And a lot of the negative things were simply airbrushed and gone. So that we tend to have a rather kind of edited version of history. So what we do need to do is we need to learn from that, good and bad, but we also have to resist the temptation to relive it. As one colleague told me, and as I've often said to people on supervision to me, we have to avoid becoming prisoners of our own real or imagined past, because idealizing that past really makes it much more difficult to move forward. So looking in as an outsider, and I think this is perhaps where I would feel more comfortable. I come from a jurisdiction where we still have the 1907 Probation of Offenders Act, where we haven't had the level of change and legislative change that the probation service in England and Wales now have as their history. And I've had that observation role for over 40 years now, just watching, sometimes looking through my fingers and hoping that it won't get worse. But certainly I grew up in probation, looking at the work in England and Wales, certainly as a model and as good practice. And as the years have gone by, we've tended to reverse and walk away and look at it more from a distance. And I think from a European context, that is also something, because I think the role of England and Wales probation in its various forms in the past has changed and has been a model and been a caution, in fact, for many other jurisdictions. But I think it's one of the things I was particularly impressed with in Gwen's thing is highlighting the reinstating of the supervision requirement as an element of the community order. And I think this is something that I certainly, as an Irish probation officer, and my colleagues certainly in most jurisdictions in Europe would regard, is that the core business of probation is supervision. It's engaging with people. It's working with people. And I think this is one of the real challenges that certainly I've observed over the years, is how that has become subsumed into it. And I think that particularly that whole a kind of commodification of probation tasks, it certainly struck me as something that moved people away from the relationship towards managing people, managing relationships, brokering services. And I think that really puts a lot of pressure on a relationship, because you can exercise authority, you can be clear, it's not an equal relationship. But above all else, probation is a human enterprise. It's a working alliance with human beings at its center. And the notion of the probation officer as a broker, or as somebody who simply is controlled by either something as rigid or inflexible as a wrongly interpreted risk assessment, or overly controlled in terms of accountability. I think certainly I cherish the role of discretion, but it's discretion that's managed and supported and structured. And I think we're coming back to that idea that supervision process has to be at the center of probation practice. It's the core business, and we need to empower our probation officers to feel that they have that accountability, but also have that authority and that responsibility, because it's what we do. There is also a separate part is about the relationship with staff And I think it's about making sure that probation doesn't just work on negotiating with other bodies, authorities, and so on like that, but it also has to engage its staff. And this is where the leadership challenge comes in, because I think there's been, we're not just delivering services, supervising people, we're actually managing people who do that work. And so they have to have an ownership, they have to share that engagement, and they have to have that commitment. We've learned a lot, but I think we have to learn how to manage people, because I think one of the biggest things, certainly, and I think when we were talking about the challenges of complex practice, I think was the need to rebuild belief. We need to build identity, the need to rebuild and to build security and safety, but also trust. You have to trust your own organization. You have to be able to trust your colleagues, and people on supervision have to be able to trust you. And this is where I see the strong common bond between what we've been describing, hearing about today, about how the probation service is. Effectively, the probation service is experiencing the same level of trauma or similar levels of trauma as anybody on probation might have been. And I think we need to learn our lessons from that, recognize the importance of identity, to recognize the importance of skills, of trust, discretion, of security, and feeling that they're part of a team. They're not under a microscope with somebody trying to blame. If I operated like that as a probation officer, I don't think I'd be regarded as, if I simply policed my people on probation, then I think I would be feeling that I'm missing something, because it has to become a joint enterprise. And with the rise of technology, EM, risk assessment, there's a whole issue with the helping role. And I want to quote my old 1907 Probation of Offenders Act, the role of assisting, advising, and befriending is still at the core and should be somewhere at the core of probation. We are accountable. We are looking after public protection. We are looking at safer communities, but we are remembering the human element in probation. And to do those things, it's going to be quite a challenge to reinstate that, to create that as a shared goal and a shared purpose. Because as probation professionals, and we do have to respect the expertise of everybody in the probation service, to working together and to recognize that all their contributions, that change is a slow process. The one thing that we all kind of hear about in probation is about the role of desistance and the role of strengths-based, and it was mentioned there today, and good lives model and the practice. We have to look at how do we apply that to the change process in probation. And I think that, as Gwen said at the end, this is not going to be a quick fix. This is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of slips and steps, and it's going to take a lot of rebuilding. But I think above all, it's going to require leadership, but it's also going to require trust in leadership. So there's a shared endeavor. It has to be between both staff and leadership, but also it has to be between probation officers and people they supervise, but between probation officers and the other organizations they work with, whether it's the police, the courts, whether it's the probation service and the other criminal justice agencies. Again, it's about building a level of trust, but building an identity and building that over time. And it's a question of time. The challenges are a bit like, again, looking at this, it reminded me of something like trying to do a repair on a car engine while you're driving down the motorway at 60, 70 miles an hour. If you're going to try and keep moving and do the fixes at the same time, it's going to take a lot of creativity to actually do it. It may require a little bit of slowing down. It may require a little bit of additional work, but we're talking about trying to re-engineer a major organization while continuing to maintain services and continue that process. I think that's a challenge, and it has to be recognized as a challenge. similar to what Gwen said about having resources. You don't make changes, you don't make this level of changes without a huge amount of investment, both in training, in restructuring what we're doing, but actually learning what we're doing. And I think that's where I want to mention looking outside, because there is a risk in any organization, particularly when it's under pressure and in crisis, to look inwards, to kind of be preoccupied with what they're doing and what's happening with them. I think it's also important to look at what's happening in the world of probation across the world. There's a whole agenda of probation happening, not just in Europe, but in Asia, in America, in North, South America, Africa, everywhere else. They're all developing and at their own pace, in their own way. There's a lot to learn from each other, learn about what works, what doesn't work, but learning and sharing together. I'm president of CEP. CEP is a European organization, but it's a European organization based on the Council of Europe. So that's the 46 member countries in Europe. I think England and Wales has played a major part in that development in the past. It's been a major contributor to the development of probation in Europe. And I think probation in Europe, probation across the world, will always be willing and available to help and to support and sustain. So I think we should look at ways, how can we work together and how can we pull together to actually make things work better? So I think with that, I will bring it to a conclusion, because I know if anybody knows me, this is only the beginning of a conversation. I could be talking about many, many hours to come, but I promise not to inflict that on you at this particular moment. But thank you again for an excellent presentation, Gwen. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation and response, Nicola. And thank you all very much for listening. And I'd look forward to hearing your questions. And please come along to CEP. Please keep your faith in probation going. And above all, keep working at it and don't give up. Thank you.
So much. It's great to hear from you. I confess to, as well as enjoying it, I've been sitting here with a certain amount of relief, because although I knew the technology was in capable hands, it doesn't always work. And I think this was very acceptable and shows the potential of hybrid events, doesn't it? May I ask Nicola and Gwen to come and sit at the front here, please, because now is the opportunity for you in the audience to pose your questions. And Jerry is still, I think, around, and he will also participate in this debate. In the nature and the spirit of the hybrid event, I want to make sure that people who are attending remotely also have a chance to ask questions. I don't know at the moment at this stage how many questions there might be, but I'd like to throw the floor open to you first. To raise some questions. I don't know who everybody is. When 1, 2, 3, when you ask your question, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself just very briefly? But so far, I've clocked Will and Mike and Wendy as the first 3.
We've about 4 questions online.
Right. So, Will, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much indeed to the Gwen for the main presentation, and to the 2 very interesting responses. I think it really struck and resonated with you. First, I should say briefly who I am. I'm Will Hughes. It's interesting sitting here. Many years ago, I was taught by Lorraine doing the MPhil, and then Jane and Rob taught me how to be a probation officer. And I think at that point, when Rob and Jane were talking to me, they were talking about the trauma the probation service was going through, and the trauma I would experience once I qualified, and I'd be surrounded by traumatized staff who were going to be leaving en masse. And I also like briefly, it's not the brief introduction I was aiming for. I started to confess recently that I'm also the son of a probation officer, and also my father used to say that the probation service was also continuously, you come home from work and say, well, things are in a very bad way, they're not going as they should be. So there is that sense of not being too nostalgic, but also recognizing that I think we are going through something different and that is uniquely traumatic. And I was really struck, I think most of all, by the graph you showed, Gwen, with the resignations, and I'm conscious, I'm really delighted. My current role is as a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and I'm really pleased to have been able to drag along about 9 of my undergraduate students and a couple of colleagues, many of whom will be aspiring probation officers. And I'm just conscious that I may have brought them to this event, and luckily they're all still sitting in the room, I'm pleased to say, and looking. But I'm wondering if you or anyone here can offer them words of encouragement, or would you just tell them not to do it?
So I think it's Robert Harris once said that the probation service had come to more crossroads than the average lorry driver encounters in a career. Gwen, Nicola, what do you say about it? Is it uniquely bad now, or uniquely challenging now, to frame that more positively?
So what I'd really like to do is throw that question out to any current practitioners.
I'm the senior probation officer working in the Cambridge Court team, and my first senior probation officer used to say that the probation is like a pendulum; it's always swinging, and she coined that just right. I would say I really enjoyed the lecture, and it resonated so well with me. You would have seen me like nodding frantically at the time.
Yes, I know that.
And especially the point where courts are insulated. I've been in the court since 2014, and yes, we are quite insulated. But I would actually say that although it does seem quite bleak, I actually think that the unification has given us another go, at doing something that could change the wrongs, and I think that it's quite exciting being on where we are, because we can have change now. We were going down a horrible path with the CRCs and MPS, and it was wholly unpleasant for everybody. But I actually think that now that we can start sort of building up, and like you say, yes, we need to look at what approach we take to that. And I think for me, it's about finding our own identity before we can go forward. But I would encourage people to be probation officers. I've been in probation for 17 years, and if it's in your soul, it's in your soul. And whilst I don't know what the rest of my career is going to look like, I really enjoy being a practitioner and being on the front line, and I would struggle to move away from that area, because it can be really, really rewarding. It can be frustrating and you hate it, and it's a love-hate relationship, but
Thank you so much for that very positive note. I think we do need to hear things like that. Gwen, I don't know if there's anything that you want to. You can tell she's a trained probation officer, because as soon as the audience asks a question, she gets the audience. Working alliance, that's cool, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that answer was so much better than any that I could have given, and I would never sit here and try to speak for current practitioners, because it's just not possible. I'm involved, as is Nicola, in some research at the moment, looking at the experience of unification, both kind of nationally and in one case study area. It's far too early for us to say anything about what we're finding, but that might be, for anyone who's thinking about coming into the service, that might make for interesting reading, maybe over the next year or two, to find out what other practitioners are saying about their experience. I think I would just say, that chart that I showed with the resignation rate, that's not unique to the justice system or to probation or to prisons. It's a national trend. I think I heard a report on the radio recently talking about the numbers of people who just resigned from their jobs nationally during and since COVID, many of whom are in their 50s apparently, and many of them are not looking for work, just kind of stopped, which is quite an interesting social phenomenon. So in a way, I feel I should apologise for that chart, because it has a certain shock value. I was trying to make a point, but it's not unique to probation, albeit that I expect there are particular conditions in probation at the moment that are making some people think again about
shows and course of action.
Sorry, the guy at the back who looks
Well-
like he might want to say something.
No,
Oh, okay.
I don't want to guillotine discussions. Some of these could go on profitably for a very long time. I want to make sure people have the chance to express their views. Mike, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and I'm looking forward to reading your new opus soon. It's Mike Guilfoyle here. I used to be a probation officer in London. I now sit as a magistrate in South East London, and I thank the presenters and wonderful, thoughtful, challenging and informative presentations. I remember Nicola as a refreshingly critical practitioner in London in the 1990s, and I thought that she's certainly going places. So it's nice to see you again, Nicola. You flagged up, when you flagged up the RA, rehabilitation activity requirement. I mean, this is my RA day. In fact, this is my activity requirement. I'm actually in Cambridge, and I work in South East London. There's a strong probation presence in the courts in South East London, and it's an area with heavy offending in both at Bromley and Bexley Magistrates Court. But the issue of the RA is one that persistently disappoints, and I say that, obviously you've alluded to that. In reports that I've read, I've been sitting now for over 8 years as a magistrate. Obviously the RA is probably more recent, but are hopelessly vague. They are calculative lotteries. You can never tell why some days are a number, what calculations behind that. And as you rightly indicate and outline in your talk, Gwen, the bedrock of relationship-based probation practice is sadly absent in the articulation of a proposal in a report. I just offer those observations because they do resonate, and obviously the confidence of the bench and magistrates is important. I realise it's not going to be an overnight thing. It's just a simple suggestion. I mean, the House Journal of the Magistrates Association is the magistrate, surprisingly enough, and I think a critical conversation and a critical introduction to the topic that you alluded to today, which I know is ongoing, might be something to consider. So that at least some visibility, because when I sit on the bench and they say RA, my colleagues say how many days. They don't say how many days. What's the content of the RA? What's the purpose? What's the rationale? And is this a reviewable option for the bench? And I think, in a sense, you've caught something very pivotal, and hopefully you can take it forward in the way I described.
We'll work for you then, Gwen.
Yeah, me too.
Gwen or Nicola or Jerry have any response to that?
I mean, when you've written that right, I have, but I just being there, Mike, thinking about the role of pre-sentence reports and that kind of interface with reports of that. I understand there's a pilot going on at the moment that increases the kind of quality of this. Always, I think this is going to be critically important, and it's a core skill of interaction with the court, and obviously in terms of assessment and starting a supervisory relationship with somebody. So I think the fact that that's being recognised as a gap and a really important interface is something that is really positive at the moment.
Well, I'm interested in what Jerry might have to say that this is from a European standpoint.
Can I just commit? One of the things that struck me in the comments there about, and I'm not talking about England and Wales because I don't have the knowledge or experience, but I do understand where probation officers can be vague and overcautious in their comments to courts, because there can be a fear of being wrong. There can be a degree of risk aversion. And I think this comes back to confidence and clarity and purpose and clarity and role. If the probation officer is not clear about their role, if the probation officer is not clear about their authority, is not clear about their standing, then they're going to be cautious, and they're not necessarily going to be as effective either with the other professions or with the people they're working with. So I do go back to this thing about identity, caution, about learning how to become a probation officer and actually being a probation officer. I've often said to young probation officers, if you're right 100% of the time, then you're doing something wrong. So you do need to be prepared to take measured risks. You do need to be able to stand up and argue a point. And I think that's a skill, but it also comes from having an organization that has clear purpose and clarity in what we're doing.
Thank you, Jerry. Wendy, your question, please.
Yeah, hi, Wendy Martin. Thank you, first of all, for quoting heavily from HMIP. I'm a probation inspector. One thing, and I guess I could be accused of harking back to a golden age, but one thing I see a lot with practitioners, you said, Gwen, about this is going to take time. I think there's a lot of reliance on these new staff coming through the door. Being the panacea. Personally, I'm not convinced that the training programme that people are going through now provides them with the expertise to be able to manage probation in the way that I think probation should be managed. And it's kind of what probation is going to look like in the future, really, and how people should be trained and equipped to deliver probation.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. That's really interesting. I think probably everyone in this room has a view about probation training, and probably those who are sort of former practitioners, or we might say pracademics, perhaps again have their own golden age as far as what training ought to look like goes. But I do think that's right. You know, there's perhaps a false security and false sense of security, thinking, oh, there are all these hundreds and hundreds of people who are training coming into the service. While they're training, they need people to sort of mentor them and oversee their work, and those people are then drawn out of their frontline duties. So it's kind of, again, it's having that knock-on effect of actually reducing potentially the person's power at the front line, which I think is an issue. And as somebody mentioned earlier, you know, it's not just experienced people who are thinking about leaving the service, it's also, you know, I can only say this anecdotally, trainees are not necessarily sticking the course, or they're not sticking around for very long once they qualify, perhaps because of the particular conditions and understaffing at the moment. So yeah, I think it's definitely.
Sorry, did you want to come in?
Just to say that, yeah, it's certainly something I've heard as well, that just in terms of, you know, the potential imbalance in terms of having lots of trainees and people with sufficient experience, and rightly, you know, there's attention being paid on kind of reformulating training and looking at that also there, but there's also kind of a recognised gap on in terms of continuous professional development and training for staff who are in there and looking after those staff in terms of development over time as well. And I think that potentially affects people's stickability or wanting to stick with something if they feel there's kind of roots around those kind of supports also.
Helen's been very patient. I'm going to ask you for your question, Helen, but then I'm going to take a couple of questions from our online audience to honour our promise to them, to give them a chance. Helen.
Helen Stonefield from the Probation Institute, although these views are not necessarily from the Institute. I suppose I wanted to say that I'm not absolutely convinced we can just roll on and rehabilitation will come from what we talked about today. I think we need something much more fundamental. I think there are some very, very serious issues, some things we talked about today and some we haven't. I am convinced that one way or another probation has to be cracked out of the civil service. It doesn't seem right to me at all that an organisation which must be working on the ground with communities is sitting in the shadows in the civil service. So that's absolutely fundamental to me. I think second with that comes this question of closer to communities. I don't have a golden age about probation ever really being locally run or locally managed. I think that we've never really been close to communities. And I think there is a massive problem about the failure of us collectively, beyond the justice system, our failure as a community to ask communities to engage with the people within them who have committed, who have broken the law. As a consequence of that, I think one of the things we need to do is be much better engaged with the voluntary organisations. It seems to be a continuous struggle to try to
really recognise and embrace the contribution of the voluntary sector in criminal justice. I don't know why. I can go back to my own experience of thinking that the voluntary sector was always coming to get my job. For heaven's sake, I hope we're well beyond that now, but we really do have to look at some of the amazingly powerful stuff that is going on very close to the ground in communities. And we have to talk to communities and ask them to become better involved. And as long as the Ministry of Justice, everything can be passed back to the Ministry of Justice forever, as it always was, there is no reason why local government in this country, why small communities, why groups in Labour parties, I've sat in Labour Party meetings, people never talk about criminal justice. You know, so there's something fundamentally, you know, essential about getting closer to communities. And I think we also need to some really much closer look at how we engage with the Black minority ethnic community and how we have managed to get ourselves into a situation where the prison population, the offending institution population, and even, you know, certainly and the probation caseload, it just increases in terms of Asian and minority ethnic communities. And we really need to kind of place this at the heart of one of the problem, because it is very, very serious. And I'm not, you know, I'm not able to articulate the next bit fully, but we need to really grasp where technology is able to take us into the future, because if we don't, it will grasp us, and it is doing, actually. There's absolutely no question about that. So I would be for a really, really root and branch review of this. I don't know who is, you know, which government will come along that is capable of doing this. Certainly isn't this one, but it has to be.
Thank you, Helen. Reactions?
Likewise, although when I hear the words root and branch, I think, well, that really comes another phase of reform. So, but I think they're all really good.
Jerry, any reaction to that, or are you content with the responses?
Well, I just throw in one little comment. It's one of the side points that came up. I've been a civil servant for 44 years in the probation service, and I don't feel I've ever been constricted in what I did. I think back in the 1970s, maybe there was a question about restricting people's public pronouncements and so on like that. But I think, as Nicola would know of the probation service in Ireland, we're not quiet. We're not well behaved, and we do go out and talk to our communities. In fact, 1/3 of the budget of the Irish Probation Service is spent on voluntary organisations and voluntary commitments. And just to take it a little bit wider, in the European context, the role of volunteers is certainly something that's going to be on the agenda over the next couple of years, following input from Japan, where they're building a whole network of volunteers in probation. And I think next in 2023, we're hoping to hold a conference on volunteers in probation as part of it. So there's put this way, it's an open opportunity. You need to build relationships, but I would go back to what I said already. Probation organizations need to have confidence. They need to have a confidence in their staff, and they need to work, and they need to have a clear identity. And once they have that, then they can communicate and talk to anybody, and people can talk to them.
That's close to the point I took Gwen to be making about the looking glass. Rehabilitation, standing the recognition applies to individuals, but also it does to organisations. Thank you, Jerry. Jane is our medium, who is moving between the cyberspace and the room. Apologies to those online, because you probably posted loads of questions, but Jane is going to have to select just one or two particular cherries from that.
There's a really lively parallel event going on here, which is great to see, and has included comments from practitioners talking about why they still enjoy the job and reflecting with each other on what would make it better and people's experience of PQIP, and repeated thanks to everybody who has contributed today for being for such interesting talks. It's hard to choose a couple of questions. There are some questions here that are very similar to ones that have come up in the room, of course. There are questions here about the future of training, about whether probation really does belong as part of the civil service. Those questions are also here. I'll take two because I know we're very pushed for time, and these might not be in the best order to ask, but one from Martin Seddon, who says, what indicators would show whether or not the probation service is on the way to being rehabilitated? So, and then also one from, again, one that is a little different from ones we've had. This one comes from Gwyneth Boswell with her thanks for the contributions. Gwyneth says, if probation in England and Wales is now an organisation experiencing PTSD, what can staff learn from this to work with service users, many of whom research has shown also suffer from PTSD or other trauma-related experiences, sometimes offence-related, which in the past have often gone unrecognised by professionals? Could this be one of the elements to be drawn on to build back better? So two questions, one, that specific one from Gwyneth, and then the one from Martin Seddon about what are indicators of rehabilitation we want. With apologies to everybody else in this lovely stream of chat that I'm looking at.
So Gwen and Nicola and Jerry, which of those two questions would you prefer to take first?
I'll take the second one, it's easier. But if I understood Gwyneth correctly, I think what I was trying to draw out in my talk was that there is this body of work around working with trauma with individuals, which obviously again isn't only specific to probation but to all kind of criminal justice involved people. Trauma is being recognised as a very significant element of many people's early history. So I think that is something that there could be a dialogue there, I think, with that kind of literature and kind of what's going on within the organisation. And I don't think that dialogue is taking place at the moment. Although it may be going on in kind of practice circles, it may be something that comes up in training courses. I might have to comment on that again, there may be people here who can. So yeah, that's the easy one. The more difficult question, indicators of rehabilitation. There are so many potentially. There are so many. I mean, one would be the kind of health and well-being of the staff, which I think is, probably on average below par at the moment, and obviously staff numbers as well. There are obviously the traditional measures of success in probation practice, which are around outcomes for the individuals under supervision, which I guess it's probably too early to say at the moment what that looks like, because I'm not sure what research is being done on effectiveness in terms of outcomes. And of course, there are the inspectorate measures, which at the moment are presenting quite a depressing picture, although, as has already been said, it's very difficult to do effective practice without sufficient staff on the ground. So I think those all kind of speak to one another.
Yeah, just I won't talk about PTSD because I don't know anything about it. So it's a good place not to talk about something. We've had indicators of rehabilitation. I was thinking as you were talking there, Gwen, Rob, you mentioned a book that Steve is a lead editor on in terms of reimagining rehabilitation. And typically we might think about success being more of something, but as we know, and this is great insights from European colleagues as well, less of something is good also, and particularly in the context of people caught up in the justice system, obviously less of imprisonment, and all the time probation has been held out as a way to decarcerate, but we know that from lots of research that both populations, prison and probation, have expanded over time, particularly in Wales and across the UK. So one measure, obviously, of success would be, in a paradoxical way, less of imprisonment, not paradoxically less of imprisonment, but also less of probation. So parsimony in that respect, which Fergus MacNeill has talked about. Fergus MacNeill has also talked about the 4 forms of rehabilitation, which is a framework for the book, Reimagining Rehabilitation: Personal, Social, Judicial and Moral. And if we were to think about those different domains in terms of thinking about what a rehabilitated service would look like, the personal might relate to the staffing that Gwen has spoken about, the social, the connection with communities. Helen has spoken about there. Judicial, I also think there's a lot to be said about people's involvement with the criminal justice system ending, and probation potentially could do more work in that respect in terms of thinking about the end of punishment for people, campaigning around issues around criminal records and so forth, and having a public voice in that respect. So I would like to see less of probation, but more of a voice for probation as a profession in tackling some of those social justice issues, and more of a role for communities. To me, that would be successful. And perhaps less, if we can find different imagery than unpaid work. That might be good as well.
I think we have just time for one final question, Steve.
Thank you. All three of you mentioned the importance of the voice of practitioners. It was interesting, Jay made the point that you've never felt particularly gagged in the Irish probation service. And it's just back to our experience of the book, really, Nicola, heavily involved. The problems are not insurmountable. And it seems like, you know, we have to make it clear to practitioners that they must get their voice into, you know, the professional journals in whatever form they want to put it in. But if we don't do that, the profession is silence. And that these things, although we need to make the civil service understand the kind of profession that we are, you can still get your work out into the public. And I just wondered if you could comment on that in terms of our recent experience.
I just definitely echo that. We all are involved in the probation journal as well, which Nicola edits, and there have been some instances where practitioners have, you know, had to jump through several hoops to get their work published. But as you say, it isn't insurmountable, and I think it's terribly important, not just for the individual voice of probation practice to be able to come through, and so that practitioners can talk to other practitioners as well as, you know, to wider audiences, but also that, you know, that question of who is the voice of probation. I made the point earlier that I was citing HMIP a lot because they seem to be the dominant voice out there. I'm personally not on Twitter, so I'm not sure what else is going on in Ether, but that's where I tend to get a lot of information about that. Perhaps isn't the way it should be.
Yeah, just to echo that these challenges are insurmountable, and there is a keenness among staff, I think, to be able to articulate aspects of practice, and obviously the time and space to do so. Obviously, it's the Probation Journal, Probation Quarterly as well, which is an excellent publication, and you know, working and kind of reassuring that it's not about wanting critique of something; it's about evidence-based. People come to practice, I think.
Steve touched upon the Irish experiences in opening that question. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I'm hearing parts of the question rather than hearing the full question. So pardon me if I answer the bits that I've heard rather than the bits that I missed. But certainly just mentioning the civil service issue. And I think this is back again to confidence, to leadership, and to kind of that whole degree of self-belief. I think if you look across Europe, you look across a large proportion of the people who work in probation are civil servants, and it's not generally regarded as a constraint. It's sometimes regarded as an asset because it gives you a little bit more leverage, and it also gives you some engagement, particularly with local authorities and so on like that. So really, it's like any problem. You work out a solution to it, or any challenge, you work out a solution. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. The classic thing is that it's about working. Most problems have a solution, and I think it requires a degree of persistence. And I think if anything else, probation officers and probation organizations are familiar with the importance of persistence, because it doesn't work the first time, it doesn't work the second time, but it's a question of working for persistence and working persistently for persistence and change. And a lot of that has to be done in how we negotiate with other bodies, with courts, with judges, and with our managers.
Jerry, on that note, we're going to end the session. Thank you very much. I've just got to have the honour of thanking a few people. I mentioned already the Institute and addressed its director and asked her to accept our thanks for this. But there are two other people I particularly want to name who've done an awful amount of work to make today happen. One of them is a colleague called Faith Payne, who has been providing administrative support. We think we're going to invite people, we can do this, we can do that. That doesn't just happen, that's somebody has to do that. And Faith, in addition to all her other busy tasks, has managed to make space to do that really efficiently as well. So thank you very much, Faith. The other person I want to mention is Jane Dominy, who's taken on an enormous amount of work in making this happen. Her skills are not just restricted to negotiating cyberspace, and in the course of the lecture, when touched upon Jane's own fabulous contribution to contemporary research in probation. But Jane has done a colossal amount, so perhaps we could applaud them before. Go to our three speakers, to our two respondents, and above all to our principal lecturer, without whose massively important, stimulating lecture, none of this conversation that we've all enjoyed would have been able to follow. So thanks all of you. Thanks especially Gwen.